Democrat Tom DiNapoli has been the New York State Comptroller for 19 years. Republican Joseph Hernandez says that's long enough. The point starts right now. Tom DiNapoli won his first election in 1972, becoming the first 18-year-old in New York to hold public office when he won a race to become a trustee of the Mineola Board of Education. After 20 years in the state assembly, he was elected comptroller, a job he wants to keep. So, what's your greatest accomplishment?
Oh, wow. There are so many during my tenure, but I guess I would point to the strength of the retirement system, the New York pension fund that I'm responsible for. You know, Marcia, we have 1.3 million New Yorkers who depend on our decisions for their retirement security. And we have the best funded big state pension plan in the United States of America. So that's a pretty good accomplishment.
Since you brought that up, the mayor of the city of New York thinks that city pension funds should divest from things involving Israel and BDS. I wonder what your position is when it comes to the state pension funds.
Well, we've had a very clear policy that we do not invest in companies that engage in boycott, divestment, or sanction with regard to Israel. And the New York Pension Fund also has had a long history of investing through Israel bonds. And we're not changing our point of view, which is based on fiduciary responsibility to get a good return for the fund.
But do you think pension funds should be investing in environmental and social concerns?
Look, especially for a public pension fund, we have to keep a broad view. We first and foremost need to make money. But the impact of where we put our money, I think, is also important. And from my perspective, having been the trustee for a long time, companies that are smart on issues like the environment, on social issues, on governance, or diversity, which is another topic that's often become very politicized in the investment world. But if companies have a good track record on assessing risk in those areas, it's going to be a more profitable long-term investment for us. So we do look at those questions. That doesn't mean we don't invest broadly, because we're a $300 billion fund.
But you also want a company that's going to make money.
We want, but you know, I would argue that a company that has a good environmental track record is a better place to put your money. But keep in mind, the biggest part of our portfolio, Marcia, is in index funds, passive investment, low fee, but it means you're broadly invested. So yeah, we're going to be in some companies who may not always like everything that they're going to do. We try to make them better, but we want to stay broadly invested in the public markets.
So what remains unfinished?
Well, you know, the work of the Comptroller's Office is ongoing. So much of what we do relates to accountability, making sure the taxpayers' money is being spent appropriately. So a big part of our operation is the audit divisions, both for local governments and for state agencies. And especially given the pressure with the cutbacks coming out of Washington, I think it's more important than ever that we make sure we're spending the taxpayer money appropriately. That's an ongoing agenda.
You know, a lot of people ask this question. Yeah. Every year, the state budget goes up by billions of dollars. Yep. And yet, it always seems like we need to raise taxes because we don't have enough money to spend. Why are we not able to live within our means, and why do we always have to raise more money when already the budget goes up billions of dollars?
Yeah. Well, keep in mind a couple things, and it's an important question that you're raising. The governor made a very clear statement earlier in the budget process this year that there was not going to be an increase in broad-based taxes. Now, by the end of the process, as you know, for New York City, there was the approval for the so-called pied-à-terre tax. But I think the challenge that the legislature and the governor faced is that we are not having as much money coming to us from Washington, especially on health care. The state has to backstop, you know, some of those cuts. And there was a serious effort to deal with the challenges New Yorkers are facing. So $1 billion was put in the budget to help most New Yorkers get a rebate to help for those high utility costs that are out there. Child care has been a big issue. New York has made a big bet in investing in child care. And of course, education, health care are always the big cost drivers. So New York is a state that is trying to provide services for people. So in this year's budget, there really wasn't the kind of, you know, some called for broad-based increase in taxes. That didn't happen.
Many people.
And that may happen again next year.
It will happen again next year.
But let me point this out. When we do a monthly analysis of how much money is coming in for the state, how much we're spending, and we just did our first quarterly update for the state fiscal year started on April 1st. Compared to projections, our tax revenue is over $2 billion ahead of where we thought we'd be. So the reality is the economy is still very strong in New York.
So here's the question. Yeah. Next year, there will be a demand to tax the rich. And next year, the childcare costs are going to increase dramatically. So do you support taxing the rich?
So as controller, my role is different than when I was in the legislature. And my position is we have to have a budget that's balanced, right? The legislature and the governor are the ones who set the priorities on the spending. And at the end of the day, I want to make sure they have the money to follow on the spending decisions that they make. You're touching on, and your earlier question touched on the real issue that we have in New York. We have this habit of not aligning recurring spending with recurring revenue. Yeah, we get through the current budget year, and this year's budget I think will hold together, but we start next year with a gap, and the cumulative gap is like $32 billion.
Which is a big gap.
It's a big gap, but again, this.
So you're saying we have to tax the rich?
No, I'm saying whatever decisions are made, they have to make sure there's revenue to match the spending. And the decisions on whether or not to tax and what the tax would be, that'll be made by the legislature and the governor. I do think, first of all, we have an progressive income tax in New York. The wealthiest people pay a bigger percentage of the personal income tax, which is our key revenue source. We do have an issue of taxpayer migration. It is not as severe as the critics say, but we are losing some of our taxpayers, not just at the wealthiest end, but we put out a report, Marcia, and those married couples between 100,000 and 500,000, we're losing too many of them.
So shouldn't we rethink our tax policy?
I think tax policy is something that you always need to look at and make sure that people are paying their fair share. Fair has different perspectives. But this is what the legislature and the governor are charged with doing. I'm just going to make sure the budget's in balance.
So let me ask you this question. So you pointed out that the city and the state agreed to pass the ever-popular, actually not, pied-à-terre tax. But here's the question that I have. Yeah. So a lot of people are now going to say, hey, wait a minute, I live in the city full-time, I shouldn't have to pay the pied-à-terre tax. But for years, they may have been saying, I live elsewhere so that they don't have to pay city tax. Right. That's a job for the state to see whether or not there's tax fraud. Is that something that you, as controller, would take on to see if people are committing tax fraud, having said previously, I don't live in the state, but now I do? I
mean, we might have a role in auditing that. I mean, keep in mind, we're not the State Department of Tax and Finance. There is a separate tax and finance department.
So what do you audit? Will you audit, for example, the mayor's program to build a new supermarket for the city? Will you audit?
We could. I mean, keep in mind, again, here's one of the issues with always in New York. New York City has their own controller, which most localities don't have. So you have two controllers, in effect, that have a role in terms of auditing these different programs. And we do try to coordinate our work with the city controller, so we're not doing double work. But we could certainly look at implementation of some of those programs, and perhaps we will.
Do you think you should?
Again, we'll see what the city controller is doing, and we'll see what is the need. We have a big state. We have a lot of places that we have to audit that no one else does but us.
Now, the reason I was asking the question is that there are some people that think that the city controller might not be as, shall I say, rigorous in their audits of the city as you might be.
Well, I know Mark Levine well. I know you know him also. He's very smart, very capable, very independent. So I would have full confidence in the city controller's position there.
So your opponent thinks it's time for you to pack it in because he wants to bring a new vision. What do you say about the idea of experience versus change?
I think track record's important, especially in the job of controller, because it's not a policy job. It really is a job that focuses on oversight, transparency, accountability. I've run a clean shop. You've covered New York government for a long time.
I've covered you the whole time.
The whole time. And a lot of the folks that I was with years ago, they're not there anymore. They had to resign, ended up in jail, whatever.
But not you.
Yeah, and not me. And I think having integrity and credibility is very important in this position. And I run a shop that is the least partisan of all the offices. I've tried to keep that tradition. It goes back to Arthur Levitt and Ned Reagan and Carl McCall. And it's a very professional operation. And I think that's what you want to control. I think some of the things my opponent's saying, sounds a little too political, not appropriate for the job.
Okay, on that note, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. Up next, a man who says he fled Cuba at the age of 7 with nothing but hope and now hopes to become the next state controller. Joseph Hernandez is a Cuban refugee who turned the American dream into reality, building a career as an entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist. Now he wants to be state controller. So, why would you be a better controller than Tom DiNapoli?
Well, first of all, Marcia, thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be with you. Look, I am the American dream. I came here at the age of 7 as a refugee. My dad was a political prisoner in Cuba, and we came here with nothing. You know, we started from the very beginning. My dad washed dishes. My mom cleaned houses just to put food on our table.
And you went to Yale, so how did that happen?
Yeah. Well, you know, in America, you can achieve anything if you work hard, which is the message that my parents always taught me from the very beginning. And, you know, we came from nothing. You know, my parents taught us to work hard, to get educated, and to have a meaningful life, to give back to this amazing country that gave us an opportunity when our own country didn't give us an opportunity. So that was my mission. And, you know, I started, my educational experience started as a scientist. I'm trained as a molecular biologist. I went to the University of Florida. I have 3 degrees there. I learned finance there. Then I went to Yale and Oxford. And, you know, I was able to build 12 companies. I ran the NASDAQ bill twice.
So why does that make you better for the job?
I don't know that it makes me better. I would say it makes me qualified, I would argue. You know, certainly I come from the private sector. I'm motivated to do this role because I believe in giving back. I believe my skill sets are well suited for the role. I mean, I know finance, I know Wall Street, I know investing. I know the importance of fiduciary duty. I know the importance of really holding people accountable. You know, as public companies, we get audited every quarter. You know, we should be auditing our government. I would argue every quarter because there's immense amounts.
Well, what do you want to audit in the government? I mean,
there's a lot of areas of.
What are the red flags for you? Well,
for me, I think Medicaid is one red flag that is just looking for really oversight. And you know, it's a $127 million budget. We've already.
Is there waste?
I'm sorry?
Is there waste?
Absolutely is there waste. You know, my calculations, we estimate that there's probably about $11 to $12 billion worth of waste in Medicaid alone. Yeah, it's massive. And that's based on national metrics, on national standards.
So why don't we do it?
I don't know. That's a great question for the comptroller that was here with you previously. You know, I would argue that we are scared of oversight. We're scared of what we're going to uncover. I think we're scared of who is in fact committing fraud and stealing from our taxpayers. I'm not.
So we don't want to take on big business?
Listen, whoever is committing fraud in our state, whoever's stealing from the hardworking people of the state who work hard, who are the most overtaxed people in this nation, we should hold those people accountable. And I think it doesn't matter who they are.
So what would you do differently in your first 100 days?
Well, I have a plan. You know, I come from the private sector, so we plan a lot. And part of the things I want to do is, first of all, I want to improve how we get returns on the pension fund. We're doing a really poor job in that.
He says he's doing a great job.
Well, that's what I would say if I was him. But no, in reality,
tell me?
Yeah.
How can you increase the amount of money we get from pension funds? Would you invest things differently?
Absolutely.
What would you do differently?
Well, the one thing I would do differently is I would bring in an in-house investment team. Much like CalPERS.
They cost money.
Sure, but it's a fraction of what we pay Wall Street. We pay Wall Street fully burdened $2.6 billion a year. I can build the best team on Wall Street for a fraction of that. And we can get better returns. We can invest directly. We can do deals that don't have this carried interest component, which is a very expensive piece of it.
So you're saying that the people that we hire to invest our money charge us a fee, and you don't want to pay that?
It's exuberant. It's exuberant for the amount of returns we've had. Last year, we had 5.8%. This year, we did a little bit better. We're almost close to 12%, about 11.6%. We did better because the AI world has done so well, because we were heavily invested in NVIDIA, because we were heavily invested in Google and Microsoft, which have done really well. But that doesn't happen every year. You really need a steady hand. You need experts. And you got to stop paying these exuberant fees that we pay Wall Street. And by the way, the other component of that, which I am very critical about, is DiNapoli, the way he allocates his capital has been on DEI policies. He doesn't look at who is the best investor on Wall Street. He uses his DEI.
You want to get rid of DEI?
Absolutely.
Why?
I don't think, because I think merit is the way we should invest. I mean, our pensioners want us to get the best internal rate of return. That's not to say you shouldn't have a diverse investment pool. That's not to say that you shouldn't have investors that are diverse. But use merit as the first filter. I think everyone in the investment world, I think everyone who contributes to the pension fund has that philosophy on one side. They want the best possible return because at the end of the day, it impacts everybody. So today, for every dollar that gets paid out in the pension fund, about 75 cents comes from returns. The rest comes from taxpayers. You and I paid the difference.
So we're not making enough money in our investments?
Enough. Absolutely.
Can you change that?
You can do that by getting better returns and reducing your fees, which is what I plan to do.
So what major issue do you think that Tom DiNapoli has overlooked?
I think the audit has been one. I mean, I think he's failed at really auditing how we manage the expenses of our state. I mean, look, when he started, our budget was $120 billion. Our recent budget is $277 billion. It's twice the rate of inflation. I mean, as a comptroller, you should raise your hand and say, this is irrational.
Isn't the comptroller supposed to be apolitical?
Absolutely.
So how can you say don't spend so much money if the governor and the legislature wants to spend it?
Because you're supposed to be the logical financial expert in the room that says this trajectory is not working. We have almost a $30 billion deficit. Our interest payments alone a month is $600 million. It's about to go to $1 billion. This is before we fill a pothole, before we pay a teacher, before we pay a cop. That's irrational. And by the way, what we're also doing is we're driving... This is the way
the state has always budgeted. How do you change that? How do you move the very difficult ship of state in a different direction?
Well, I think you have to be a logical, sound financial resource to the voters of the state, and you have to ring the alarm bell. You have to use your bully pulpit to articulate the fact that there's risk in the system. We are, as a state, spinning out of control financially. And the comptroller is not saying that. I'm saying that. I work on Wall Street. I know numbers. You can't sustain this kind of expenditure when you're driving out the tax base, when you're not auditing and removing fraud and abuse in the system. This is not a sustainable trajectory. And anyone in finance, anyone who looks at these numbers in an impartial way will make that conclusion.
So what would be the first audit you would do? We have about 30 seconds left.
Well, the first audit I would do is Medicaid, number one. Number two is MTA. MTA is another abusive agency in our system. We give them so much money. There's no real oversight. There's no real diligence in how we analyze what they spend our money on. And that would be the second entity that I would audit.
But do you think that that's going to be enough? I mean...
Well, it's a big bolus. I would argue that those two entities probably spend a big portion of our budget, and I would argue that they are, in fact, areas where I can find a lot of efficiencies.
And on that note, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. But our conversations continue right after the show on our streaming channel, CBS News New York. Thank you for joining me. Raise your hand if you think your tax dollars are well spent. Well, it's no great surprise that few New Yorkers think that's the case. They're weighing in on your point. You think the government wastes money?
Yeah, I do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
I think every organization wastes money.
Yes, all the time the government is wasting money on unimportant things.
I think it wastes more money now than it did in the last administration.
Oh, my Lord. Do I think government wastes money?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, and yes.
What do you think they waste money on?
The government or Trump? How much time do we have?
What do you think they waste money on?
Doge.
Themselves.
Ballrooms, reflecting pools, and what was wrong with the pool.
I'd say it's most wasteful in the military.
The federal government wasting it on the war.
Stop the wars,
So you're
guys.
saying government wastes money on wars?
Yes.
Politicians.
What is?
The representatives and the senators.
So what should the government be spending money on?
On the welfare of the people.
Education and health care.
Raising minimum wages, public housing.
Better food in New York City public schools.
Health care.
Okay.
The poor.
People that need help, like, homes,
jobs, because like right now it's kind of hard to get jobs, especially with inflation too. It's a lot going on.
I think it should be spending on ways to improve our society socially, to help stop loops of poverty and crime.
Just the needs of the people.
So why do you think the government spends money on the wrong things?
I think you have an ego control problem.
Because they have a president who doesn't have a clue, only for himself.
Because they're greedy.
I think the government spends money on the wrong things, or at least to some degree does, because there's influences from a lot of vested interess.
To give their corporate partners contracts and stuff like that, where the middle class and the lower class suffer.
Because it has no common sense.
It's a lot easier to pour money into that which you know, and unfortunately a lot of people in the government and a lot of people that pass bills tend to be those that are wealthy and born into wealth, and so it's a lot easier to cycle money in a closed loop.
So what do you think can be done to get the government to spend money on the right things?
Limit their terms of office. I would like to see like a cutoff of an age, like maybe at 75 people cut off, they like the Pope, they have to retire, there has to be a changeover.
Make sure there are people who know what the citizens want and not what only the rich people want.
People need to speak up. I mean, we have a right to vote, and we need to be sure that we're voting for the right stuff.
You need right people in Congress to do the right thing.
Ask Mom Donnie. He's doing it. He's doing it right now.
Well, the only way we should do it in this country is by legislation and by Congress voting for programs that would help people, not pump up somebody's ego.